One of the sources, not the only one, of this hopelessness is an unbiblical perfectionism that does not provide people with categories to understand their own failure as a Christian. And therefore, when they stumble and fall into a sin or some repeated sinning, they don't have any way to explain what's going on in their lives, and they despair that they are a Christian.
When sin feels overwhelming, where can we find hope as Christians? In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper opens Romans 7:14-25 to stress both the reality of indwelling sin and the sustaining power of God's grace. This sermon was originally delivered at Bethlehem Baptist Church on June 24th, 2001.
Father in heaven, my heart's desire now, as we look into your word, is that you would guard me from error and grant that my spirit would be in tune with yours when you inspired this word, so that both the truth is spoken and in a demeanor that is fitting for these realities. And then I pray for every mind and heart here and those listening elsewhere, that there would be a tenderness towards the truth, and that you would grant a spiritual taste for the things of God. I pray for those without Christ, that they would be moved to see you, Father, through Him, by the Spirit, in the Word. And I pray for believers that you would help us to navigate the torturous waters between destruction of hopelessness on the side of perfectionism and the destruction of hopelessness on the side of perversity. And that we would steer a straight course to heaven. Lord, make us warriors, I pray, who get up again and again and again when we are knocked down. Teach us about your grace in this matter and about your power. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. The main thing that Paul is doing in verses 14-25 of Romans 7 is to defend the law of God against several false inferences, one in particular drawn out from the observation that Christians don't live up to their own standards perfectly. So I imagine, and I don't think it takes a lot of imagination, an objector having walked with Paul through the first 6 chapters of Romans, not believing what he's saying, in fact, very much resistant to what he's saying, and pointing out to him, now Paul, you said back in chapter 6, verse 14, that these folks are no longer under the law. And you said in chapter 7, verse 4, these folks are dead to the law. And you said in chapter 7, verse 6, these folks are released from the law. You know what you get, Paul, when you tell people they're not under the law, they're dead to the law, and they're released from the law? You get Romans 7, that's what you get. You get people who are wanting to do what they can't do and not able to do what they ought to do, and who see themselves as wretched people. That's what you get. You have made the law into disease and death. And what you get is half-baked, carnal, worldly Christians at best. So what you need to do, Paul, to get this thing fixed is to stop dumping on the law and treating it as a disease or as the cause of death. Get people under the law where they belong. Now, to that objection, Paul, I think, is having to fight on 3 fronts as he writes this. Number 1, he believes in the goodness and spirituality of the law with all his heart. So he's fighting on the front of, I am not making the law sin. I am not treating the law as death. I am not treating the law as disease. I love the law of God. The key texts are verse 14. We know that the law is spiritual. Verse 16, I agree with the law, confessing that it is good. Verse 22, I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man. Verse 25, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God. So that's one front. You can hear him saying, it is not true what you're saying. You're drawing a false inference from my teaching to say that I'm treating the law as sin and I'm treating the law as deadly. I'm treating the law as a disease. That's not what I'm saying. You're misunderstanding and misconstruing. The second front, he says, the explanation for why Christians don't live up to their own standards is not that I have put the law in the wrong place, but that indwelling sin is a mighty power in our lives. 2 verses. Verse 17. So now, no longer am I the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. That's where I get the phrase, and others get the phrase, indwelling sin. See the phrase, dwell in me? It's like a resident. An ugly, seditious, warring against my soul resident. Verse 20. But if I am doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. There it is again. 2 texts talk about this reality called indwelling sin. So his second front, the first one is to defend the law and to show that the problem is not that I have made the law to be sin. Rather, on the second front, he's defending the reality that there is such a thing as indwelling sin rooted down deep in my life. And I need to put it to death. I need to make war on it. But it's there and it's real. That's the second front. The third front is to defend his own Christian standing. He's a Christian. He wants to defend the fact that he's a Christian. I have a new nature. I have been born again. I have a taste for the things of God. Verse 22 would be one of several verses we could look at for this point. I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man. I love the law of God, he says. I rejoice in the law. But I see a different law in my members, the members of my body. I have been changed. I'm alive to God. I'm alive to the law. I have a spiritual taste now. There's a nature in me that's not just carnal. That's the third thing he wants to say. Now that brings us to the most controversial matter that I pointed out 3 weeks ago and said I would come back to in order to argue the point that I made there. And the point was this. Is Romans 7:14 to 25 the pre-Christian Paul? Is he describing his experience before he got saved? Or is it the Christian Paul describing his experience in part as he experiences it now? That's the big issue. And scholars line up on both of those sides. Godly scholars, evangelical scholars, my friends line up on those two sides. And I told you which side I stand on and said I would be back to give you reasons. And here I am. The side where I stand is, I believe he's talking about Christian experience. And I want to defend that. But first, let me tell you why it matters to me. Because you might be sitting there saying, that's about as uninteresting to me as anything I can imagine. Here's the reason I think it should be very interesting to you and crucial to you. As I've watched why people don't come to Christ for their eternal joy and rather choose everlasting destruction and misery, there are several kinds of reasons. The one that I have in mind here is a hopelessness that settles in on the soul that doesn't say the gospel is false. It just says there's no hope for me. That's all. You can argue till you're blue in the face on the intellectual level with such an objection and say, look, you're probably right. It's a frightening thing, isn't it? One of the sources, not the only one, of this hopelessness is an unbiblical perfectionism that does not provide people with categories to understand their own failure as a Christian. And therefore, when they stumble and fall into a sin or some repeated sinning, they don't have any way to explain what's going on in their lives, and they despair that they are a Christian. And you remember 3 weeks ago, I pointed to J.I. Packer, who argued and was so thankful for the book on indwelling sin by John Owen, written 350 years ago. He said that he was saved back in the 40s and immediately ushered into a kind of perfectionistic Christianity that believed in a kind of higher life, a second experience Christianity, after which you had this experience, you were above the struggle, walking in triumph, walking in victory, no more battles. And he said, I almost committed suicide. But then I read Owen and Ryle, who helped me understand a more balanced biblical understanding of sin in the believer's life. And some of you asked me where you could get that book, and it's in the 6th volume of the works of John Owen, 150 pages in the middle of that book. And I went online yesterday and found 10 stores where you can get it. All kinds of prices. The problem is you have to be desperate to read it because it's written in almost unintelligible 17th century English. Sorry, the best things have to be dug for. If you rake, you get leaves. If you dig, you get diamonds. And if you got a raking mind, you'll settle for leaves. If you got a digging mind, you get diamonds. I commend Owen as a good mine. Now, to further put you off, here's the title. The nature, power, deceit, and prevalency of the remainders of indwelling sin in believers, together with the ways of its working and means of prevention, opened, evinced, and applied, with a resolution of sundry cases of conscience thereunto appertaining. I don't expect anybody to go looking for this book now, but I promise you that if you read those 150 pages, you probably will not shoot yourself because of your remaining imperfection. You will be set on a course to know how to do battle with sin and understand your failures that saved J.I. Packer's life, and I believe will save many. So my aim this morning is to argue that this passage is about that. Namely, Christian experience in its moments of failure. That's what I want to argue. This text is about that. and providing you with categories for understanding it. I stressed 3 weeks ago, I don't want to stress as I begin now, please, please, please don't misunderstand me as saying this text teaches make peace with sin. Pastor John said, everybody's going to sin, and so relax, make peace with sin, it's no big deal. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, I would say exactly the opposite. This text is teaching, make war with sin. Make war with sin. What you read here is about a man who is on the warpath against his sin. And now he's got a spiritual nature that enables him to identify for what it really is, as horrid as it is. And he hates it. The evidence of being a Christian is not that there are no tactical defeats in the war, but that you keep fighting till the promised victory is given. That's the evidence of being a Christian. So, argument number 1. I got 5. Number 1. They're simple. You can see them yourself. I'll show them to you. It just looks like Paul is talking about himself now as a Christian because he says I, me, or my 40 times in 15 verses. And he talks in the present tense instead of the past tense. So you read things like, I am of the flesh. What I am doing I do not understand. I do the very thing I don't want to do. I find the principle that evil is present with me. For I joyfully concur with the law of God. With my mind I am serving the law of God. Those sound like now. Those sound like present experience. So I know that's kind of a simplistic, but I'm a pretty simple person. At least at first, I'm going to say, this is going to take a sophisticated and compelling argument to get me over the obvious here. That this looks like Paul describing himself. And frankly, I've read and read and read for 25, 30 years. I used to debate with a good friend of mine who teaches at another seminary now at Bethel. And these are friendly debates, class after class on Romans. So this is not a new thing for me. I've read many commentaries on this and I've collected all the arguments I can find and have written for myself responses to them all. And so some of my arguments are responses to others, and I've not been persuaded that anything overcomes that simple observation. Argument number 2. He speaks about the law of God in a way that I think only a Christian would speak about it. And I don't have in my mind here mainly verse 16, which says the law is good, or mainly verse 14 that says the law is spiritual. I have mainly in mind verse 22. Where it says, I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man. And I see that word, that phrase, inner man. And it rings bells from the other places where Paul uses it about Christians being strengthened in the inner man. What I hear in this phrase is, I have been awakened in my inner man. I have now been given a spiritual taste for things of God. I now see the law for what it was really designed for, namely to lead people into a life of love. And I love it. I joy in it. That doesn't sound like an unbeliever to me. And it doesn't sound like a Christian interpretation of an unbeliever. And it doesn't sound like a Pharisee who might have said he loves the law, but Paul would have to say from his perspective is a false, carnal, unbelieving joy. That's not what this sounds like when Paul says, I joyfully concur with the law of God. I don't think he's describing a Pharisaic, hypocritical love and joy in the law of God. That's my argument number 2. Argument number 3. Is this divided man who's tortured at some point in his life and saying, oh, wretched man that I am, I don't do what I want and I do what I don't want. Is that what Paul's experience was before he was a Christian? Is there any way to know? Well, there is. Because there are at least 2 passages one in Galatians and one in Ephesians, where we know Paul is talking about his pre-Christian experience, and we can read them to see how he saw himself. So let me read them to you. Galatians 1:13, Paul says, "For you know you have heard of my former manner of life in Judaism." Now we know he's talking about his pre-Christian experience. "How I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions." That's Paul's description before he was a Christian. "I was unwaveringly zealous for the law and for the traditions." You don't get an impression reading that this man was some days failing and some days succeeding and hating himself when he failed and loving himself when he didn't. That is not the picture you get of the pre-Christian Paul out of his own mouth. There's an even more important one. Philippians chapter 3, verses 4-6 goes like this. "If anyone else has a mind to put confidence in the flesh, I far more, circumcised the 8th day of the nation of Israel." She's cataloging all the things he could boast in if he were a mind to. "The nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness which is in the law, found blameless." So if you ask Paul, tell us about your pre-Christian life, he says, blameless from the perspective that I had then, and in a legalistic way, powerfully blameless. He didn't say, wow, before I was a Christian, I was absolutely tormented. Some days I kept the law, some days I broke the law. I was crying out, wretched man that I am, over and over again before I became a Christian. That is not the way he describes himself. But you know what? When you're born again and a new nature, a spiritual nature is created in your heart and the Holy Spirit comes to dwell within, the battle begins. The battle begins.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper continues our 9-part series, The Divided Man, with a sermon titled, The Christian Struggle. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.